What's the matter? They too yellow to come out and fight?
They'll come.
Shotguns. They got shotguns. Spread out. Spread out! Come to disarm him. Raise your hands over your head.
Once upon a time, 98 years ago, at 2:35 on the cold afternoon of October the 26th, 1881, a long-standing and acrimonious quarrel exploded into a gunfight in a yard off Fremont Street in the town of Tombstone, Arizona Territory. The whole street brawl lasted no more than about 35 seconds, and yet it was destined to become a supreme folklore story in the violent history of the American West. Tonight, we look at those legendary 30 seconds through the eyes of the cinema, and as we meet Wyatt Earp and his brothers Morgan and Virgil, Doc Holliday, the dentist turned gambler and killer, the Clantons, the McClowrys and Billy Claiborne, we try to untangle the fantasy from the facts, which resulted in the most notorious shootout of all time, the gunfight at the OK Corral. By the time the fight took place in the 1880s, America was firmly on the road to becoming the richest nation on earth. The wounds of the Civil War were slowly beginning to heal, and once more, man had the opportunity to unite with his brother in order to pursue the ideal which has always been closest to his heart, the accumulation of wealth. By 1869, the Union Pacific Railways spanned the entire continent, and the dogged pioneers continued to push ever further westward, raising their cattle and sheep, claiming their farmland, and discovering the almost unlimited mineral wealth which was to build the factories and fortunes of the future. It was the age of the boom town, which would spring up virtually overnight around a rich discovery of gold or silver. And as the miners flocked in to strip the earth, so others moved in to strip the miners. The gamblers, the saloon keepers, the prostitutes, the confidence tricksters, and last, but by no means least, the taxman, who doubled the job with that of law enforcement officer, collecting the money for the government and keeping a slice of it for himself. This, then, was the breeding ground of men like the Earp brothers, who arrived in just such a mining town, Tombstone, on December the 1st, 1879, little knowing that they were about to write one of the most controversial chapters in American history. This version of our story was made in 1970 and entitled simply Doc. The seedy characters and atmosphere have a genuinely authentic feeling, and it's the nearest any of our films comes to explaining some political realities of the West at the time. Wyatt Earp, played by Harris Yulin, has invited Doc Holliday to join him in Tombstone. Holliday is played by Stacy Keach.
Tell me about Tombstone.
A man named John Bean, who was to become a crucial figure in the events which led up to the gunfight. Let's now examine these events and introduce ourselves to the main protagonists on the other side. The seeds of the trouble were first sown in July 1880, when some mules belonging to the government were stolen and traced to a ranch owned by two brothers, Frank and Tom McClowry. Riding with the cavalry troop, which went to recover the animals, was Virgil Earp, in his capacity as Deputy U.S. Marshal, and his brothers Wyatt and Morgan. Caught in possession of the animals, the McClowrys insisted to the army that the Earps be sent away before there was any discussion about returning the mules. The reason for this was simple. The horse thieves were part of a loose-knit gang of smugglers, rustlers and highwaymen, which included people like the Clanton family. And whereas the army would be here today and gone tomorrow, the Earps, in their capacity as law officers, certainly would not. The cavalry agreed to the offer, the Earps were dismissed, but the mules were never returned. And emboldened by their success in the encounter, the McClowrys later warned Wyatt that any more meddling in their business would lead to his death. It was from this tiny, almost insignificant incident that everything else was to grow. But 8 months later, on March the 15th, 1881, an event of major importance took place, which was ultimately to lead to the final mayhem off Fremont Street. And that was the attempted robbery of a stagecoach. Only one of our films even makes an attempt to feature this robbery as an integral part of the drama. And that, once again, is Doc. We join Wyatt Earp and Holliday as they ride up to the Clanton Ranch to ask some questions.
I'm going to give you fair warning, Marshal. Get off of my ranch.
Looking for some Wells Fargo gold. And the man who stole it.
Nobody here had anything to do with that gold. And we don't steal money.
Where's Johnny Ringo?
I ain't seen him.
Although that film is the only one to make a serious effort to explain the implications of the stage robbery, it nevertheless persists in totally misrepresenting the facts. Wyatt Earp didn't ride out to the Clanton Ranch with Holliday. He didn't get involved in a fight. John Ringo was never identified as one of the men at the hold-up, and nobody got away with any money at all. What happened was this. On the night of March the 15th, the Tombstone stage arrived at nearby Contention City, following an attempted robbery. A gang had ambushed it on the trail, killing the driver and fatally wounding a passenger, but had failed to get their hands on the $29,000 cargo of bullion. A posse under Virgil Earp and John Behan, the man you remember who had pipped Wyatt to the post of sheriff, set out to track down the robbers. The group included both Wyatt and Morgan, and it was Morgan who managed to catch one of the culprits, a man named Luther King. King confessed to being at the scene of the crime and implicated 3 others. For the record, their names were Leonard, Head and Crane, all close friends of the Clantons, and Leonard, incidentally, also a friend of Doc Holliday. King was taken back to Tombstone by Behan, and the posse continued to search for the other 2. Now, quite apart from it being their duty as peace officers to arrest the gang, there was another, more personal reason for Wyatt Earp and John Behan to want to catch the robbers. In 18 months' time, the citizens would be electing their sheriff, a lucrative post to which Behan had only been appointed as an interim measure. Both he and Earp were desperately anxious to get the job. Neither wanted the other to share in the glory of having captured the killers, an achievement which could weigh heavily with the voters. And that wasn't all. There was bad blood between Wyatt Earp and John Behan, and this account wouldn't be complete without disclosing it. It had to do with Earp's love life. Lived in Tombstone. He had been married to a girl who died and was now living as man and wife with a woman named Mattie Blaylock. It wasn't perhaps quite a perfect relationship, but it had survived for almost 10 years and would probably have gone on doing so, had not Wyatt become madly infatuated with someone else. The someone else came in the shape of a pretty 19-year-old ex-actress named Sadie Marcus, who'd traveled to Tombstone to be with her fiancé, who'd divorced his wife and promised to marry her on her arrival. Treating Mattie very shabbily, Earp wooed Sadie and won her, but in doing so, he made a lifelong and bitter enemy of the lover she'd discarded, John Behan. So now we have a potentially explosive situation. 2 men, rivals for the same job, rivals for the same girl, each burning for the prestige of being the man who caught the stage robbers. All that was needed to light a roaring fire was one match, and the match was supplied by Luther King, the one member of the gang in custody. Before making his escape, which someone certainly arranged, King implicated yet another man in the plan to rob the stage. It was none other than Wyatt Earp's closest friend, Doc Holliday. This was total disaster for the Earps and their political ambitions. The truth is that Holliday had been involved in the hijack, but this was almost beside the point. What really mattered was that his close association with the Earps would be virtually certain to badly tarnish their image in the forthcoming elections. Furious with Holliday, but forced to cover up his part in the crime, Wyatt Earp made contact with one of the few people who'd know where the other highwayman could be found, Ike Clanton. The deal he offered was this. Clanton would betray Leonard, Head and Crane for money, the $4,500 reward money, plus another $1,500 which Earp would pay from his own pocket. Ike and Frank McClary would lure the men to the McClary ranch, and the Earps would kill them. Thus, at a single stroke, enhancing Wyatt's reputation in his bid to become sheriff and absolving the family from any charge of complicity in the hold-up. Both Doc Holliday's and Clanton's roles in the affair would be quietly forgotten. A bargain was concluded, but almost immediately it went sour. Before the Earps could get anywhere near them, Leonard and Head were killed attempting to rob a store. Then, 2 months later, Jim Crane also met his death, along with Ike's father, Old Man Clanton, at the hands of the Mexican army. With no common interest to hold them together, the relationship between the Earps and the Clanton gang got worse than ever. Another staged robbery took place. Again, the culprits were friends of the Clantons. Again, the Earps were the arresting officers. By now, there was real hatred between the two sides. And then something happened which was to make open warfare inevitable. News of Ike's secret deal to betray his friends leaked out to other members of the gang, and their reaction was coldly unambiguous. Get into Tombstone and prove no such deal existed, or face the consequences. The gunfight, which was a direct consequence of Ike Clanton's visit to Tombstone, features in all 4 of our films. And we're now going to examine each for him by Doc. As with Clementine, the gunfight is said to take place at dawn. And along with that, there are scores of other errors. Ringo wasn't there. The sheriff wasn't killed. Billy didn't run off into town. There was no wagon, and so on and so forth. Before we look at our last 2 dramatizations, I'd like to try and briefly describe the events which followed Ike Clanton's arrival in Tombstone, and which will lead to the final confrontations with the Earps. There are a variety of sources on which we can base this reconstruction: newspaper reports of the time, personal memoirs, court records, eyewitness accounts, and many of them contradict each other. But no film so far has attempted to make use of the material. Clanton arrived in town at about 10:30 on the morning of Tuesday, October the 25th. With him was Tom McClary. McClary's movements are something of a mystery, and they've never been clearly established. But Ike Clanton's are a matter of record. He made for the saloons and began a bout of heavy drinking. In one of them, the Alhambra, he met up with Wyatt Earp and angrily accused him of leaking details of their secret deal to betray the stage robbers to Doc Holliday. Wyatt sent for Holliday so that he too could face the accusation, and the fearsome dentist arrived in town at about midnight in a bad temper and itching for a fight. After some heavy drinking, he found Clanton, who was unarmed, eating a meal in a chop house, and he went for him immediately. He's enraged that Ike had been bandying his name about, called him a liar, no good son of a bitch, and offered him a gunfight. Faced with an immediate and direct challenge, Clanton attempted to back down, but later that night his bluster returned. He became increasingly drunk and abusive. He was still drunk by morning, and now he was also armed, something strictly forbidden within city limits. Still threatening what he was going to do to Holliday and the Earps, he suddenly came face to face with Morgan and Virgil, who cracked him over the head with a pistol and arrested him. Whilst Clanton was at the courthouse, Wyatt had run into Tom McClary, who was also armed. McClary had boasted in the past that he'd kill the Earps if they gave him trouble, but on this occasion his attitude doesn't seem to have been particularly aggressive. All the same, by now everyone was distinctly edgy, and after an exchange of words, Earp challenged him to pull the gun he was wearing. When McClary refused, he too was bashed with a pistol and left bleeding on the street. At the courtroom, Ike Clanton was fined $25 for carrying firearms and released. But by now, his brother Billy and Frank McClary were also in town. Frank, incensed at the beating Tom had received, was in fighting mood, and by 2:15, all 4 men had gathered at the OK Corral, some of them armed, all swearing to kill the Earps and Doc Holliday on sight. With them was a friend named Billy Claiborne. Our third gunfight, in Doc, is throughout an attempt to provide an antidote to previous hero worship of the Earps. But in seeking to redress the balance, it weakens its case too much by going too far the other way. This film would have us believe that there were 7 men in the corral, not 5. But apart from vaguely identifying the Clantons and McClowrys, it fails to make clear exactly who they are. Among them is a boy, referred to only as the Kid, who's developed a hero worship for Holliday and who Holliday symbolically destroys.
Holiday, this ain't none of your affair. We're here to talk to her. To talk.
Ike Clanton, Andy Warshaw, Latigo, Curly Bill Brocious. Who's in the corral, Verge?
Billy Clanton and the McClowrys. Disarm him. Raise your hands over your heads.
The Hour of the Gun, with a screenplay by Edward Anholt, was made in 1967 and directed by the same man who made the gunfight at the OK Corral, John Sturgis. Half of the men named in that clip, which you've just seen, either weren't there at all or didn't figure in the gunfight as shown, nor were all the men in the corral killed. But let me now leave criticism aside and turn to the event itself, not as it happened on the silver screen, but as it really happened. When Virgil Earp heard the news that the 4 armed men were on the street in open defiance of the law, he finally decided that enough was enough. Calling on his brothers and Holliday for assistance, he set off up 4th Street towards Fremont to disarm them. As they started out, he was carrying a shotgun, but not wishing to unduly alarm the townspeople, he passed the weapon to Holliday, who concealed it under the long buffalo overcoat he was wearing and gave Virgil the cane he was carrying in exchange. Presently, the 4 men saw a friend of the Clantons, Billy Allen, scuttling off to the left of Fremont with the warning that the Earps were coming. And a witness heard Morgan say to Holliday, "Let them have it," and Doc reply, "Right." They now came across Sheriff Behan, back from his errand, walking up Fremont Street towards them. Behan, his hands extended, called "Stop," but was brushed aside by Virgil. "Don't go down there, you'll all get killed," said Behan, and then proceeded to totally contradict himself by adding, "I have already disarmed them." So much then for the sheriff, who took no further part in what followed. For as soon as the Earps had passed him, this is what they saw. Just off Fremont Street, which ran along here, was a yard located between the assay office and Fly's photo gallery here. At the mouth of the yard, just off the street itself, were the following: Billy Clanton with his horse, Frank McClowry with another horse, Frank's brother Tom, Billy Claiborne, and finally Ike Clanton himself. The rear part of Fly's photo gallery was a lodging house with doors here and here. Here was an alley separating Camillus Fly's own home, and right down here the rear portion of the OK Corral, the front half of which opened onto Allen Street. Even a cursory study of the layout makes another historical fantasy apparent. The celebrated gunfight at the OK Corral never actually took place at the OK Corral at all, but in an empty yard behind the corral itself. Here then are the positions of his knees, but he got up almost at once and loosed a shot at Frank, which missed. Wyatt now fired a shot in the general direction of the bucking horse, causing it to bolt across the street and thus expose Tom McClowry to the full horror of Holliday's shotgun. Doc opened up with both barrels, and it was at almost point-blank range. The wound the charge inflicted was absolutely massive, and it put Tom McClowry out of the fight from then on. It practically took away the whole of the left side of his body. He staggered around in a disarranged circle, ignored by everybody, and finally ended up down Fremont Street, where he died clinging to a telegraph pole. At this point, Billy Allen, who was still hiding down there, fired a shot in the general direction of the Earps and missed. And now, Ike Clanton, the main instigator of all the trouble, the man who bragged his way around town for at least a day and a half with lurid threats, ran up to Wyatt Earp with the trembling plea, "Don't shoot me, I am unarmed." In view of what was going on all around them, the stilted phraseology of Earp's reply is even more astonishing. He said, "This fight has now commenced. Get to fighting or go away." As he said so, he threw Ike from him into Fremont Street and returned a shot in the direction of Billy Allen. Clanton, pursued by 2 shots from Holliday, dodged into Fly's photo gallery and ran through to the rear. Billy Clanton was now ready to fire again, left-handed, and his target was Morgan. Both men shot almost at once, Clanton hitting Morgan with a bullet which entered the right shoulder and passed across his back to exit at the left. Morgan hitting Billy in the left breast. Billy fired again, and then as he cocked his gun once more, he was met by a fusillade of shots from the other 2 Earps. One from Virgil took him in the stomach, another from Wyatt in the left shin. By now, Ike Clanton had emerged from the rear of Fly's house, but as Holliday loosed off 2 more shots in his direction, Frank McClowry, with his terrible stomach wound, made a last desperate attempt to get back into the fight. Turning to Holliday, he yelled, "I've got you now, you son of a bitch," and both men fired and missed. But Morgan Earp, lying wounded on the ground, didn't. Steadying his gun with both hands, he put a bullet clean through Frank McClowry's temple, killing him on the spot. The whole fight had lasted 35 seconds, and this was the toll. Unharmed, Wyatt, Holliday, Ike Clanton, and Billy Claiborne, whose only injury was a stray bullet through the knee of his trousers as he ran away. Wounded, Virgil in the leg, Morgan in the back and shoulders. Mortally wounded, Tom McClowry with his massive shotgun injury, and Billy Clanton with bullets in his stomach, breast, shin, and wrist. Both died shortly afterwards. And dead on the spot, Frank McClowry. That then was the reality of the gunfight at the OK Corral, an event which was to lead to the destruction of the Earp family's political ambitions in Tombstone. Story of little glamour, glory, and nobility, complex, rather squalid mixture of politics, money, fear, and sex, the basic ingredients of a million lesser tragedies. And what of the survivors of that October afternoon of 1881? Within 2 months, on December the 28th, as he was walking at night through the streets of Tombstone, Virgil was cut down in a hail of shotgun fire, receiving wounds which would leave him a virtual cripple until the day he died. Ike Clanton was amongst the assassins. 3 months later, in March the following year, Morgan Earp was shot dead through the window of a billiard hall in a saloon as he was chalking his cue, preparing for a quite different shot. Again, the murderers were associates or friends of Clanton. Of the suspects, Wyatt personally tracked down and killed 3, one of them who was only very slightly involved in circumstances which do him little credit. But he never had the satisfaction of a final showdown with his old archenemy Ike, who met his death 6 years later at the hands of a deputy marshal who killed him resisting arrest. Billy Claiborne was shot dead a year later as the result of a quite different argument, and that leaves us only with Doc Holliday and Wyatt himself. Doc, one of the deadliest and most feared killers of his time, died somewhat ironically with his famous nickel-plated Colt pistol silent. Consumptive and alcoholic wreck, he coughed away the remains of his life in a sanatorium in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. He was 36 years old. As for Wyatt, he'd left Mattie, who never recovered from his rejection of her and committed suicide with an overdose of laudanum. Now he was completely free to enjoy the rest of his life with Sadie. Along with her, he traveled all over the States, pursuing the various activities of saloon keeping, horse racing, gambling, finally settling in a summer home in Los Angeles, from where he'd visit each winter the 100 or so small mining claims which provided them with a modest living. He mixed happily with the Hollywood community, and towards the end of his life granted some interviews with author Stuart Lake, which provided the basis for Lake's highly romanticized biography, Frontier Marshal. The old man, though, never lived to see the book in print. For on the Sunday morning of January the 12th, 1929, Wyatt Berry Stapp Earp died. He was 2 months short of his 81st birthday. It's taken the cinema nearly 40 years to gingerly approach the truth about Wyatt Earp, and yet in a way that's understandable, because heroes are rare, and we love them, and we don't want to see them destroyed, because in killing a hero, you also kill a little hope. So filmmakers have tended to honor the legend rather than the man, a legend which Earp himself found a constant embarrassment. Walter Houston, Randolph Scott, George O'Brien, and Richard Dix were never required in their various films to come within a mile of the real character of this monosyllabic, introverted man. And the same applied to other movies too far from the truth to merit inclusion tonight. Guy Madison in Outlaws of the Rio Grande, James Stewart in Cheyenne Autumn, and Joel McCrea in Wichita. And yet, strangely enough, two such distortions will probably remain the best remembered. My Darling Clementine, with Henry Fonda's decent integrity shining like a good deed in a naughty... James Garner and Jason Robards in the same roles are far more low-key and down-to-earth. Some critics found them dull, a conclusion which, in retrospect, seems less than fair. And so we're left with Frank Perry's Doc, an ugly, brutal film with little humour and few redeeming features in any of its dishonest, rather shop-soiled characters. And yet, taken as a whole, it's the nearest the cinemas come so far to the realities of the whole sad, sombre tale. So in true Wild West style, the last taciturn word must belong to Harris Yulin. Good night.
Can't do it, Wyatt. It's out of my jurisdiction.
Settle it in court, Johnny. You're not going to solve anything with the gun.
Now, you'd be surprised things you can solve with a gun.